Welcome back to the McConnell Center series, Why You Should Read. Series where we try to help you find your next great read, your next great author. Please like, subscribe to this content and share it with those who might benefit from it. It really helps our work to have you engaged with us in that way. Well, today we want to introduce you to someone, a writer, a thinker, and a priest who had a connection to our home here in Louisville, Kentucky, and that is Thomas Merton. And to do so, we have with us today Mark C. Meade, who is Assistant Director of the Thomas Merton Center at Bellarmine University and a past president of the International Thomas Merton Society. So you can see we've got the right guy for the job. He has explored existentialist themes in Merton's writing and Merton's connections to other writers such as Victoria Ocampo, Albert Camus, and Flannery O'Connor. He's published in Cistercian Studies Quarterly, Cistercium, the Merton Annual, the Merton Journal. You can see a theme developing here. U.S. Catholic, and Living City. He's lectured on Thomas Merton not only in the United States but in Europe and in South America. So as I said, we didn't have to go very far, but we found the right guy to introduce you to why you should read the works of Thomas Merton. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mark Meade. Mark.
Thanks so much. So pleased to be here. I will begin with one of my favorite sections from Thomas Merton's autobiography, The Seven-Storey Mountain. October is a fine and dangerous season in America. It is dry and cool, and the land is wild with red and gold and crimson. And all the lassitudes of August have seeped out of your blood, and you are full of ambition. It is a wonderful time to begin anything at all. You go to college, and every course in the catalog looks wonderful. The names of the subjects all seem to lay open the way to a new world. Your arms are full of new, clean notebooks waiting to be filled. You pass through the doors of the library and smell thousands of well-kept books. It makes your head swim with a clean and subtle pleasure. A key moment of Merton's autobiography, published in 1948, is the above experience found about a third of the way into the book. It is 1935. Merton is starting his second year at college at Columbia University in New York after a reckless failure of a first year at Cambridge. Readers in college or having been to college can recognize the universality of this moment. It's not just about a cooler, drier atmosphere in parts of the country with changing seasons that leaves behind the languid humidity of summer. The first feelings of chill in the air are instilling that primordial mammalian urgency to store up food for the winter. First, the beauty of changing leaves emphasizes change, and then the reality that things die with the changing seasons. As a grade schooler, most of the agenda was set, but with college comes freedom and agency to choose classes and to make a break from family and friends. Autumn seasons of change positioned at one of life's crossroads can be a time of reckoning and a challenge. New classes and ideas calling us to question whether we accept the values of that family we have left behind, the mores of our hometown, or the opinions of our grade school classmates. Merton found Manhattan and Columbia University a fertile ground to ask these ultimate questions. Despite a forced divestment from his parents, having been orphaned through the death of his mother when only 6 and his father when 16, his artist parents did not raise him with a firm foundation in religion. His mother had broken with her parents' casual Episcopal church attendance and became Quaker. However, as stated, that influence left his life as a small child with her death. His father had an Anglican upbringing, but again, was not a regular churchgoer in adulthood. With the death of his father, his English guardian, though a supporter of Tom's academic and professional pursuits, held religious faith in contempt Merton's collegiate questioning of life's meaning had very little religious foundation to draw upon. Perhaps the Columbia Merton entered in 1935 seems distant to us, yet almost a century on, maybe it's not as distant as it seems. The U.S. was amid the Great Depression. Unemployment was around a quarter of the labor force. In many ways, young people of today have similar skepticism of the future, with a housing market seemingly so far out of reach, and terms like late-stage capitalism coming back into vogue. So even among the privileged students of an Ivy League university like Columbia, young people had doubts about the future of the current economic system. The Soviet Union was still young, and its government did not make it easy to obtain information of how Russians and others under its aegis were faring under communism. This was a time of the highest interest in membership in the United States in communist organizations, and colleges were active places of recruitment. In Merton's struggle to find himself, to uncover meaning and understand a tumultuous world in depression, he found himself drawn to attend one communist meeting. However, the days of Comrade Merton were short-lived. He did not return. The one aspect that stuck with him, however, was the Oxford Pledge, a resolution never to take up arms in war. Merton took it seriously the rest of his life, but he also recognized the hypocrisy of the young communists pushing the pledge in 1935 and renouncing it in 1936 when there was a call to arms against the Francoist nationalists in the Spanish Civil War. War became a recurring theme of Merton's autobiography from start to finish. He begins the book, quote, "On the last day of January 1915, under the sign of the water bearer, in a year of great war, and down in the shadow of some French mountains on the borders of Spain, I came into the world. Free by nature in the image of God, I was nevertheless the prisoner of my own violence and my own selfishness, in the image of the world into which I was born. That world was the picture of hell, full of men like myself, loving God and yet hating him, born to love him, living instead in fear and hopeless self-contradictory hungers. Not many hundreds of miles away from the house where I was born, they were picking up the men who rotted in the rainy ditches among the dead horses." By 1916, just a year after Tom was born, his artist parents moved the family to the U.S. because of the encroachment of the First World War. His father from New Zealand and his mother from New York met in art school in Paris, and his father was in southern France painting landscapes. Escaping war in France, the family moves to Long Island, New York, where his mother's parents live. By 1918, his younger brother, John Paul, is born, just as the First World War is coming to armistice. John Paul's life would also be bound to the story of war. In 1921, Ruth Merton dies of stomach cancer. The prevailing wisdom of the time was that children should be spared from witnessing disease and death in hospitals. The sharp 6-year-old who could already read gets the news of his mother's untreatable cancer by letter. So the uprooted nature of his life from birth until taking vows of stability at a monastery continues. Parting from his younger brother who stays with his grandparents, he moves with his father back to southern France after a few years in Bermuda. In France, the motherless child of an English-speaking family must adapt to a new language and cultural setting. For so much of his life, the role of outsider was thrust upon him. Later in life, he would embrace elected marginality and chosen solidarity with societal outcasts, making him a more incisive cultural critic. Just before our equivalent of high school, he moves to England as his father continues to respond to demands in the creation and sale of his paintings. Here, not at one of the top boarding schools for the elite like Eton, but a respectable school called Oakham, Merton distinguishes himself enough to earn a prestigious scholarship to Clare College at Cambridge. However, after having adapted again to a new country and culture, he loses his beloved father at 16 to a brain tumor. I mentioned before a guardian in England after his father's passing. Tom Izod Bennett helped provide young Tom with some stability after his father's death, and encouraged him to continue his education and to make a trip to Rome in the great tradition of the grand tour made by upper-class British youth. Bennet's disdain of religion would not have prompted young Merton to look to any spiritual solace in the death of his father, yet Merton, unexpectedly, maybe even to himself, when he made the trip to Rome, he found himself drawn to the glories, not to the glories of classical Rome, its Colosseum, its Pantheon, pagan temples, but the splendor of centuries of Christianity. Across from the Forum, Merton feels drawn to enter the church of Saints Cosmas and Damian. He writes, quote, "What a thing it was to come upon the genius of an art full of spiritual vitality and earnestness and power, an art that was tremendously serious and alive and eloquent and urgent in all that it had to say. And it was without pretentiousness, without fakery, and had nothing theatrical about it. Its solemnity was made all the more astounding by its simplicity, and by the obscurity of the places where it lay hid, and by its subservience to higher ends, architectural, liturgical, and spiritual ends, which I could not even begin to understand. I was fascinated by these Byzantine mosaics. I began to haunt the churches where they were to be found." Possibly, Merton recalls that as his father was dying and was losing the facility of speech, the art he was producing from his hospital bed resembled early Eastern Byzantine Christian saints. In his room in Rome late that night, never having really been instructed how to pray, he began to feel the presence of his father, and in his words, he, quote, "began to pray, not with my lips and my intellect and my imagination, but praying out of the very roots of my life and my being, and praying to a God I had never known." This momentary closeness to God through the beauty of art, through a spiritual connection with his father, not yet a conversion, planted a seed, but was soon undermined by his own abandonment into the hedonistic college life at Cambridge. Like many of the important decisions one makes in college, the importance of friendships and more freedom to choose and associate with different groups of friends, independent of family, become important determiners when it comes to character. There is a dualism running through the seven-story mountain. Merton contrasts good and bad places that are often inhabited by people corresponding in virtue or vice. Cambridge was one of those dark places in Merton's autobiography. From descriptions of its geography to his dissipating lifestyle of spending more time in pubs than classes, to friends who seemed to bring out his worst instincts. The culmination was his scholarship being taken away, as Merton later in life wrote after, quote, "a year of riotous living." Here we return to where we started, Columbia University in 1935. He's closer to his remaining family, his younger brother and his grandparents on his mother's side on Long Island. This time in New York, good friendships would be his redemption. Later in life, he wrote to his friend Jim Forrest, quote, "It is the reality of personal relationships that saves everything." Sometimes the influence of his friends came to bear in unexpected ways. Once Merton had been cured of his curiosity about communism by getting a little too close to how a sausage was made, figuratively, in the young communist meetings. He was also not immediately prepared for the path forward. He had talented friends interested in writing who would later distinguish themselves as poets, editors, journalists. He would join them in editing the yearbook, and Merton submitted humorous sketches and cartoons for The Jester, Columbia's satirical magazine. Merton tried quite unsuccessfully to grow a mustache and almost as unsuccessfully to write novels. Only one of his attempts would later be published, well after he established himself as a very different kind of writer. Merton's particular voice in writing would come through a spiritual lens. But first he needed to discover his own spiritual path. Being left either so free to find his way through parental free spirits that he had no structure, or having the influence of his British guardian who looked down upon religion, he needed to chart his own course. Merton was blessed to encounter a variety of influences to evaluate. Many of his friends were Jewish. One of them, the family of Cy Freedgood, was hosting a Hindu monk, Mahanbrata Brahmachari. Merton described Brahmachari as, quote, a shy little man, very happy, with a huge smile, all teeth, in the midst of his brown face, and on the top of his head was a yellow turban with Hindu prayers written all over it in red. And on his feet, sure enough, sneakers. Merton had read Aldous Huxley's Ends and Means and came away with the impression that all the serious mystical tradition came from the East. However, ironically, it was Brahmachari, the Hindu monk, that told Merton, quote, you should read St. Augustine's Confessions and the Imitation of Christ. Knowing Merton came out of the Western tradition, he suited his recommendations to Merton in this way and started Merton upon this path. Soon, Merton took classes in the medieval philosophy of Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic philosophers. He came to understand the intellectual underpinnings of the Christian West. The art and poetry of William Blake showed Merton an unorthodox vision of Christian mysticism, but one that would broaden his horizons and build upon the aesthetic foundation whose seed was planted in Roman churches through poetry he had read in England of the Catholic convert turned Jesuit priest Gerard Manley Hopkins. Beyond intellectuals and aesthetics, maybe it was a concrete experience that had the profoundest effect on Merton's conversion. Close to the campus of Columbia, nestled along 121st Street, and no higher than the blocks of apartments on either side, stands the Catholic parish of Corpus Christi. Having passed it many times, Merton felt an impulse drawing him inside. What blew him away was, here in the city that never sleeps, in the center of commerce, there were people totally silent and in prayer. They were there not to see polite society or to be seen, but simply to be present to God and to pray. Thomas Merton, an extroverted guy, a popular date with women, someone who could be the life of a party, also had a side that craved time in solitude and silence. The life of contemplative prayer that would be his future was revealing itself to him. Soon after, he sought instruction from the parish priest and was baptized and received into the Catholic Church at Corpus Christi the fall after his graduation, as he began work on a master's degree. Again, how crucial is the choice of friends. Another of his Jewish friends, the poet Bob Lax, later who became a Catholic convert as well, challenged Merton with this question: what do you want to be anyway? And Merton writes about his response, quote, I don't know. I guess what I want to be is a good Catholic. The explanation I gave was lame enough and expressed my confusion and betrayed how little I had really thought about it at all. Lax did not accept it. What you should say is that you want to be a saint. A saint? The thought struck me as a little weird. I said, how do you expect me to become a saint? By wanting to, said Lax simply. Don't you believe that God will make you what he created you to be if you will consent to let him do it? All you have to do is desire it. All this time, meanwhile, the world hasn't stopped turning as Merton was trying to work out his interior life. The Depression drags on, but now the Europe Merton knew and loved was turning again to war, threatening to destroy the fabric of the Christian culture he'd come to embrace through a leveling of churches, but far more sinister in the desecration of the image of an incarnate God and the human slaughter being unleashed by a Nazi war regime. Amid this, Merton, with the zeal of a new convert, not only feels he wants to be a good Christian, or better yet, a saint, as Lax had challenged him to be, he thinks maybe he has a call to the priesthood. Franciscans at first eagerly welcome him as a potential friar, but he's just missed the entry date and must wait another year. Then on the precipice of entry, he lays out all the history of his wild years and while in tears. It's unclear whether it was something he said or his breakdown and emotion in telling them this, but they turn him away, at least at that time. But Merton assumes his prospects are forever finished. However, The professor who taught him medieval philosophy, Dan Walsh, suggested he leave New York and make a retreat in rural Kentucky, about 50 miles from Louisville, at the Trappist monastery called Gethsemane Abbey. At this point in the story, it's important to note the distance Merton was traveling, not just in terms of geographical distance, but in cultural distance and almost a distance in time. Gethsemane Abbey of the 1940s would have been like a step back to the 19th century. Monks herded cows, made a French style of cheese, and worked fields of vegetables using horses and no mechanized farm equipment. Then, as now, the diet was almost strictly vegetarian out of a spirit of simplicity, except for feast days. Monks slept in communal rooms with straw mats. Silence was so strictly enforced that a system of sign language was used to communicate basic tasks around the farm and monastery. Monks rose at 2:30 a.m. and met 7 times a day to chant the Psalms and another time for Mass. It was a sharp contrast in life to noisy Manhattan. It was also a vision of heaven to a person who craved time for silence and contemplative prayer. Returning to teach English in upstate New York at St. Bonaventure College, he was presented another fork in the road. He heard a lecture by Catherine de Hewitt Doherty, who had established a ministry to the poor, mostly African-American residents in Harlem. Merton saw this calling as meaningful and worthy. However, a second visit to Gethsemane Abbey made Merton almost certain that he would set aside his dreams of being a novelist in the New York literary community and ready to be anonymous, he thought, and disappear into the austere, hardworking, penitential, and quiet life of a Trappist monk. One other thing made that calling clear to him. I mentioned the echoes of war that reverberated through Merton's life. The draft board had been sending messages. Merton had earlier pledged not to take up arms in conflict. Though not many claims of conscientious objection were recognized among Catholics at the time, Merton stated that he would have driven ambulances in war zones. Instead of negotiating with a world that seemed bent on its own destruction, Merton boarded a train on December 7th, 1941, that day that will live in infamy, and arrived at the Abbey of Gethsemane on December 10th, taking the robes of a monk and making the monastery his home for the rest of his life. Thomas Merton's younger brother, John Paul, was looking for the quickest way into the action in Europe and elected to join the Royal Canadian Air Force. He visited the neophyte monk Tom, now having taken the name Brother Lewis, at Gethsemane. In conversations during his brief stay, John Paul took instruction in the faith and was baptized Catholic at the monastery. After leaving Gethsemane, he shipped out, was stationed in England, got married on base, and later went for a flight mission over the English Channel in 1943. The plane malfunctioned and crashed, and he was reported missing in action. He survived the crash, but not long enough for the rescue team to arrive. Near the end of the 7-story mountain, Merton includes a poem for his brother, the last of his immediate family to die. Is this the end of the story? Merton has elected obscurity and succeeded? Not quite. Merton's abbot, the head of the monastery, recognized that Merton had an interesting conversion story. Not all monks coming to the monastery in rural Kentucky had lived in various countries, gone to Cambridge and Columbia, or were on a first-name basis with Hindu monks. Charged by his abbot to write down his life story, he sends it to a Columbia friend who is now an editor at a major publisher. The chosen title, The 7-Story Mountain, gets its inspiration from the 7-leveled mountain of purgatory from Dante's Divine Comedy. Published in late 1948, the autobiography became an instant sensation, staying near the top of the New York Times bestseller list in nonfiction throughout 1949. With many turning to nihilism after the revelation of the Second World War's atrocities, the story of a young person who had found meaning and beauty had massive appeal then and continues to have interest now. Over 75 years on, it has been translated into at least 23 languages and remains a classic among spiritual autobiographies, likened to a modern-day Confessions of St. Augustine. With all its acclaim, Merton himself sometimes had misgivings about it in the decades that followed. If I had written my life story in my late 20s or early 30s, the self of my 40s might be a wee embarrassed by some of the things I had said as a young man. Far from the testament to Merton's obscurity, its success, of course, ensured that he would be asked to write more. Continuing to write under Thomas Merton when he was brother and later Father Lewis was not much of a veil of anonymity. It sometimes caused Merton crises between living the quiet life he had dreamed of and honoring the art of writing he was gifted at. He would go on to publish books of poetry, spiritual reflection, but also essays covering dialogue between Catholics and Protestants, Christians and other faith traditions, and Christians and non-believers. He addressed environmental concerns, indigenous rights, racial justice, and war, but always through a spiritual lens informed by his life as a contemplative monk. Interfaith dialogue was one of the themes that brought Merton to various countries in Asia in late 1968. Still a monk, and with the blessing of his abbot, he traveled more than he had in his previous 27 years. Merton had arrived at Gethsemane on December 10, 1941, to become a monk when almost 27 years old. On December 10, 1968, the 27th anniversary of his arrival at Gethsemane, he addressed a meeting of monks and nuns from Southeast Asia at a Red Cross center just outside of Bangkok. Merton was 53 and now the well-known author of over 40 books. He delivered his morning address and returned to his room to rest and shower in the hot climate before another address he was to give later in the day, but it was not to be. He was found dead in his room with a running fan over his bare chest as he was seemingly preparing for a shower. The freak cause of death was reported an accidental electrocution. For a final time, war overshadowed his life as his body was sent back to the U.S. in a military plane, also carrying the bodies of fallen soldiers from Vietnam, the Vietnam War, which he had opposed in his writings. Though Merton later felt embarrassed by certain parts of his autobiography as he grew older, he clearly still thought it expressed something important or captured what it meant to be a young adult in that quest for meaning. In early 1967, he made a self-evaluating graph of his books from awful to better, none achieving the highest rank he puts on the sheet of best. The autobiography gets that better rating. I think Seven-Storey Mountain endures because it captures the urgency of finding meaning at a crucial point in our young lives. However, it would be less enduring if the quest for meaning ended at this early but critical juncture. What registers as a disappointment from Merton in his autobiography is a similar sentiment to all his books. It's not hyper self-criticism, but the instinct to always be on the journey to learning new things, keeping one's mind open, and trying to get ever closer to the truth. Merton ends Seven-Storey Mountain with the Latin phrase, sit finis libri, non finis quaerendi, or thus ends the book, but not the quest. The quest for truth Merton set upon was not only discerned in the abstract, but something to be discovered in life experience and in conversation with those good friends he found at Columbia and kept meeting throughout his life. Like he told his good friend Jim Forrest, the reality of personal relationships saves everything. I hope that all of you listening have the company of good friends that can help you in times of adversity and in times of asking profound questions. Through the Seven-Storey Mountain, Merton continues to challenge us with this question: what truth will you discover in this, quote, fine and dangerous season in America? Thank you.